it's important to clarify what is imperialism. Because, I mean, it's easy to use that word pejoratively, but what is imperialism? A very quick shorthand: imperialism would imply that your economic system is premised on using internationally extra economic force of one kind or the other, to get your own company's advantages and your own country an advantage. This could be where, a country says, if you don't buy from us, then we're going to use all our diplomatic military force, to sanction you or to somehow make your life miserable. So then you'll end up giving us the contract. Basically that's it. It's more complicated than that, but I think that's a good thumbnail sketch. So let's take the continent of Africa, because this is the most sensitive point of this conversation. In 1885, European countries met in Berlin, and without the presence of any Africans, they divided the continent amongst themselves. Initially, they left small places. They left Morocco, not very small, Morocco, a couple of principalities, Ethiopia. Eventually, they swallowed those up as well, after 1885, in several wars and so on. Only Ethiopia was able to withstand the Italians, but even for a time, its land was conquered. So the whole of the African continent was divided up between European powers, and the United States was also at the meeting. So US plays a role in this, because of course Sierra Leone, and so on. So let's not be casual about the past. So from roughly the 1880s, when there was this direct colonial intervention, until 1960s, and in some cases 1970s, the Portuguese colonies. So almost for 70, 80 years, the West actually withdrew the sovereignty of African people. And I'm not even going back to the slave trade. Leave all that. I'm just talking about from the 1880s to the 1970s. The West essentially stole the sovereignty of African people and plundered the continent. I mean, the most horrendous is the story in Belgium, obviously, where Leopold essentially wiped out the population in order to make a ton of money. Okay, let's put that on the table. That we know is colonialism. We also know it as imperialism, because after the West, left the African continent, as Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his 1965 book, Neocolonialism, you gave us back political sovereignty, but by then you had made us surrender our economic sovereignty. Till today, French-speaking countries in Africa, Francophone countries, are part of the French franc, and they are reliant. Their profits are basically sitting in French banks. These countries have no economic independence. This is the Francophone countries. If you look at the other kind, like look at the Congo. I mean, it is basically it's a free plunder for big corporations. Glencore, which is registered in Switzerland, is the largest cobalt extractor from the Congo. Cobalt is so essential to batteries and so on. So let's face it, it's basically a lot of European, Australian, Canadian, and American mining companies that continue to plunder the continent. Let's just keep that there. The main companies that are currently exploiting the African continent are from Australia, Canada, the United States, and many European countries, including Switzerland. That's the bulk of the exploitation. China has a very different history in Africa. Initial history was through the kind of socialist Maoist orientation, building the Tanzam Railroad and so on. It had old relations with the government of Julius Nyerere in Tanzania and so on. Very old relationships with this fantastically important person, A.M. Babu, who was eventually in the government of Nyerere, very much a Maoist in his orientation. They welcomed the Chinese into Africa to give them technical assistance and so on, in Angola as well. Over the period, Chinese government intervention into Africa has been largely on a state-to-state basis. It's been these kind of projects, over the years. After the 78 reforms, things began to change. Companies began to come and try to bid for projects. Now, this is very important. Chinese firms in the entire continent of Africa, but let's take the case of Zambia as an example. Chinese firms bid for projects. They don't come in and go and see the president of the country and say, if you don't give us the project, we'll withdraw, we'll ask the IMF not to help you with your debt that's coming up, or we'll bomb you or whatever. I mean, until now, let's face it, what evidence we have suggests that Chinese firms, even state-owned firms that come in and bid for contracts, they're bidding on a commercial basis. So what you see is commerce. China's economy has grown rapidly, and a lot of the raw materials that go to China don't go to China. They go through Glencore, cobalt mined by Glencore, goes to a German company in China where it's manufactured into something and it's sold in the West. China is the territory on which the raw material is processed and manufactured into a good. It's not going to China. I mean, Glencore extracts it. Even when a Chinese government company or a Chinese private entity extracts the mineral in Africa, it often goes to European companies or American companies inside China to manufacture. Not always, but often. So let's be clear that this is certainly part of modern capitalism. Zambia has raw materials. In another world, Zambia would not have to sell its raw materials at such low prices. We would like copper not to be sold so cheaply. It's a precious thing. We need to find a way for a country like Zambia to generalize the kind of profits of copper for its population. It's scandalous that in the copper belt region of Zambia, the children who live above that, 60% of them cannot read, who live above the copper. That's because the wealth is taken out and nothing is really given to these people who live right there. This is a point of great criticism. But China is not the responsible party here. The responsible party is capitalism. Capitalism is at fault, and I think one should focus on that. It's convenient that, much of the press attacks China for colonialism in Africa. Come on, guys, let's be serious. There's a long history of real colonialism. This is commerce. I have a problem with capitalism. I even have a problem with some kinds of commerce, but it's not China that's the author here. China is participating in a world system. That's a separate issue. The problem is global capitalism, not China.